Hello. Thanks for joining me and welcome to my budget special. Well, after months of speculation, rumour, briefings, newspaper articles, we are here. We're here. We know the budget. It arrived yesterday. We know that. But what does it really mean? What does it really say? How is it going to shape our economy, our industry, our lives? What does it mean about the government? What is really going on behind the scenes, eh? Well, we're going to be unpicking this and really getting under the skin of this budget and giving you a level of insight which you will not necessarily have read in the papers or seen on TV. Joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is the renowned political analyst Greg Baker, who is chair of Baker Kell Cumming. He'll be helping me unpick. And for those of you who listened to my most recent webinar with Greg on the King's speech, a lot of what Greg said did come to pass. We talked particularly about the fiscal rewriting of the rules, which then was not at all mainstream, but has now become very much mainstream and is something that we'll come to later on, okay? So welcome, Greg. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Good to see you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks. And also, before I do launch into asking you a whole series of questions about the budget, just remind everyone that please use the opportunity to ask questions as a chat. Just whatever question you want, please pose it and I'll make sure that we'll do our best to answer it, okay? So please make best use of Greg. And so really, Greg, to start, what is your initial perspective on the budget?
Well, I think the biggest positive for me, Andy, is that we're smack bang in the middle of half term at the moment. So having a chance to kind of duck out of childcare duties for an hour and a half to come talk about politics is always a plus. But more kind of seriously, I think as an overview, I think the most important feature of the budget yesterday was precisely as you just mentioned, and we sort of anticipated over the past 6 months, is that government attempt to redefine public debt, something we've been talking about in our intelligence reports for quite a long time. Now, what we saw in the documents that came out after Reeves had finished her speech yesterday was a little bit more detail from the government on their two new fiscal rules. So there's a stability rule and there's also an investment rule. Now, at the risk of kind of sounding a sort of overly cynical, I think that those two rules are essentially meaningless. One of them rests entirely on ministers' own definition of what constitutes investment. And we think that's likely to include an ever-growing list of public sector spending items. So it's not just kind of infrastructure that comes up with a return. And similarly, we expect the second of those rules to eventually be kind of undermined by ministers being tempted into repeatedly changing the way that it calculates net financial debt. So in other words, ministers will almost inevitably claim that debt is falling, even whilst the government borrows more and more and more. And they'll try to justify that by increasing the estimated value of public sector assets that have been purchased with that money. So it's a bit of kind of an accounting wheeze, really.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of it means that the government's going to be borrowing an awful lot more to try to get out of the hole that they're in.
Yeah.
And
I was going to say, Greg, I mean, for what I understand, we're talking about the equivalent to another 40% of GDP.
Well, I think that's the kind of upper limit of where they think that they can get to without being punished by the markets. So they're not looking to borrow that much right away, but they think that there's appetite in the market to be able to lend the UK government considerably more money. That's the whole gamble. That's the whole show for this Labour administration. They basically think they can borrow a lot more money without facing significant penalties in terms of debt servicing costs from the market. Now, they might be right. That could work, because the UK doesn't operate in a vacuum. And if international money markets look around the world and they think that every other country is in a slightly worse state than the UK, in some senses, it doesn't really matter how bad the investment proposition is here. The money will still come here because it's not quite as bad as next door. But that's something that's not in the government's gift. It's not in their control. So it's a very big gamble. And it's that they've now they put everything onto black, and they just kind of have to hope that it's out.
Yeah, it's funny because obviously this is a big bold play. I mean, we first had the chance to talk about a 22 or so billion pound a black hole, and now they've raised the equivalent of almost 40 million pounds worth of taxes. So clearly, this is a government that means business when it comes to tax revenue, and it needs to have that balance now between being able to raise taxes, borrow, but also instill a climate of growth, right?
That's right, and they really do. They really do need some of these investments to come up with a tangible, positive return, financial return, very quickly, and your level of confidence in their ability to do that will depend on how you see the public sector being able to either pick winners or put money into projects that quickly create a financial return. I think that there's a considerable risk that over the course of the next couple of years, a bit like a gambler chasing a loss at a racetrack, I think there's a considerable risk that the government could steadily increase the amount that they're borrowing as they become more and more desperate to find projects that do create a good financial return if the first few start to falter.
And what sort of projects are we talking about that they're looking to invest in that will create this opportunity?
I mean, I think that's one of the big unknowns. Really, it's something that it's something that is well worth keeping an eye on. When people think about investments, borrowing to invest in sort of big national projects, they automatically think of big infrastructure projects, and I think that there will be some of that. But I think that definition of viable investments will be stretched and stretched and stretched by ministers to include all sorts of new things as well that you wouldn't necessarily think of in your first sort of your first picks. So after the sort of obvious infrastructure projects, I think they'll quickly turn to large-scale social housing projects. I think there's going to be a lot of money being borrowed to be put into those, and then I think that definition will get stretched even more. So you'll end up with, for example, some public sector civil service salaries being included as investments that create a financial return for the country. So the money will be borrowed for an ever wider, sort of ever longer list of spending items. Yeah.
So just to be clear, they borrow the money, so it's debt, but it's classified as an asset.
Some of it is, yeah. So that's been the big change, and that's what we'd seen coming from a few months back. The hope is that by persuading the markets that borrowed money spent on viable investments or physical or intangible assets does create a value for the government and for the country, then the markets don't mind lending more.
Do you think that, just looking at some of the other tax raising revenue, do you think that things like the increase in employer national insurance contributions is going to work out, or could that have a big impact on possible growth going forward?
Well, I mean, you don't have to take my word for it having an impact on growth. The government's own audit body, if you like, the OBR, has said it's going to have growth. I mean, growth is pretty, by the OBR's predictions, growth looks extraordinarily anemic for years and years to come. And I think that's why Reeves had a bit of a sort of hard sell on the media round this morning, basically saying this was a one-off budget, and don't worry, I won't do it again. I think probably she will, actually.
Mm.
But I think there's a number of measures there that are not conducive to growth. But it comes back to something we've spoken about before, Andy, where I think most Labour administrations, certainly since the war, have been primarily focused on the redistribution of wealth. I would argue that this administration is not primarily motivated by the redistribution of wealth. It's instead primarily motivated by the interests of the public sector, by the civil service. So at the same time as you had bus fare increases and the NIC changes that the OBR suggests is going to cut the number of low-paid jobs by about 60,000. You've also got a lot of money going into public sector salaries, a lot of money going into public sector bodies, and to the extent that I'll give you a good example to the extent that the government doesn't really think that there's a problem with the way the public sector is operating. So it paid lip service to trying to improve public sector productivity, to addressing the idea that there are unproductive bureaucratic quangos slowing down the country. Its solution, its prescription to that, was to create another unproductive bureaucratic quango called the Office for Value for Money, which will now go around all the other parts of the public sector trying to identify how they can be more efficient. I don't think it's a recipe for success.
Well, I think it's an interesting narrative that, which some of the press are picking up, some of the press aren't picking up, about the fact that this is a government at the moment seems to be that is full of ex-civil servants, and they are focused on, as you say, the state and increasing the role of the state, and that's, I think, going to be a big feature of the next couple of years over the next cycle of the government, right?
I think so. And I mean, there are obviously strong arguments on either side as to exactly what the role of the state is and how it can perform best in the public interest, which ultimately is everyone's ambition. I think one of the few things I was actually surprised at with this budget was the kind of political sluggishness, in terms of how they handled some of these announcements. So to give you an example, and this is what I mean about the sort of trying to get more bang for the buck with the public sector. So you can argue whether it's good or bad to have lots of money into public sector, but if you agree you are going to put more money into public services, I would suggest there's an almost universal consensus that it is a good idea to try and get the best value for that money, to get the most out of it. Now, within only the past few weeks, Starmer gave an explicit speech about a speech in which he was explicit. He wasn't rude. But he gave a speech in which he was explicit about the need for the NHS to reform before it was given any more money. No reform, no more cash. Those were his words. Whereas yesterday, Rachel Reeves turned around and awarded a £20 billion boost to the NHS without demanding anything at all in return in terms of performance, efficiency. There was no, you can write the check, but try and get something specific back from it. And that's before we've even got into the kind of winter crisis season, when I expect there would be one this year. And I expect that the government's response to that will be to simply write another check.
Yeah, and did you think, looking at the money that's been promised for the NHS, for example, is that simply to make sure the NHS continues functioning, or has that been earmarked for big infrastructure projects like new hospitals, that sort of thing?
I don't think it's been earmarked to that specifically. It's really just to kind of keep the engine going. But I think that there's, certainly within the Treasury, which again makes it so surprising that Reeves didn't demand something more specific for it. But within the Treasury, amongst sort of senior officials that we speak with all the time, there's a kind of a privately stated agreement that you can throw money at the NHS and it doesn't actually make very much difference. As much as you always have sort of political claims in elections that the NHS has been underfunded or debased, if you look objectively at the level of spending on the NHS, it has gone up over the past 30 years pretty consistently and at a real rate of knots. And it's higher now than it ever has been. But at the same time, the productivity of the service, the number of people it treats and how well it treats them has gone down.
Just before I ask another question, just to remind everyone, if you wanted to ask questions, please just ask questions in the chat zone and we'll be more than happy to answer them as we go along. But I'm talking about infrastructure spend as well. Obviously, there'll be more money promised for schools, new schools, more money for special education needs. So clearly, the government is focused around what needs to happen going forward and how the built environment that we all work in can support that. Yeah. Was there, from your perspective, was there good news if you're a local authority or if you're a construction company or an architect looking at some of the commitments they're making towards social housing, as you already mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are probably two things I would encourage people on the call to look out for that weren't necessarily sort of highlighted in Reeves' speech or picked up by the media yet. The first is that one about social housing. I think there's a lot more money going into that. I think that the idea that the government's going to sufficiently reform the planning system, that private sector housing reaches anywhere close to their 1.5 million target is just for the birds. I think the way they'll try and get around that or balance it out is putting massive amount of money into building new social housing and so-called affordable housing. So that's one area to look out for. I think that's basically going to be a growth area. The other is that sort of buried in the budget documents, there was an admission of increasing the rate at which public sector land is disposed of, is sold off. It's purely a revenue raising measure. It's something that will fall disproportionately on the MOD. The MOD's got an enormous training estate with fewer and fewer armed forces personnel to do anything with it, and so they tend to sell off more and more of the land. I think that there will be some pretty good value land going, and there will be an incentive for the government to see something done with that land, as in built on, very quickly.
And also talking about net zero, and Ed Miliband's made a beeline for where he wants to be with the whole green economy.
Yeah,
stop the licenses for North Sea, all that sort of thing. How big is that going to become, and how do you think, as an industry, we need to be on the ball there?
So I think in the immediate term, in terms of sort of political credit or debits within Whitehall, it's notable that Miliband's department got a disproportionately high increase in its funding, much more than most other departments. And if you look at the government's agenda on net zero and so on, it was notable that they're sticking with their kind of 2030 and 2035 targets as far as electric vehicles go, and sort of slowly phasing out, actually it's not slowly, but pretty soon phasing out combustion engine vehicles. That's still the stated ambition. I have my doubts as to whether or not they will be able to meet that ambition. And I think it's notable that both within the energy industry and amongst other comparable countries, there's actually a sort of sotto voce move away from the net zero agenda. There are some of the oil majors, for example, have been putting much less money into sort of mitigation measures and just openly doing more exploration in the Gulf. You see countries from New Zealand to Germany ditching net zero projects and sort of and stepping away from mandatory heat pumps and taxes on oil burners and so on. I think the UK government is probably going to, absent a massive technological advance, that can actually help us achieve net zero, I think the UK government is going to have to follow those sort of other countries.
Interesting.
So not doing it at the moment. And until it does, I think the practical implication is that sadly energy prices in the UK are likely to continue to rise and to be comparatively expensive, because we will be increasingly reliant on LNG imports, interconnectors to the UK, and then eventually to nuclear power, but that won't come online for quite a long time.
I've got a couple of
gloomy. Sorry,
that's all right. Well, I suppose it's not so much gloomy; it's you're just trying to be realistic, I guess. And this is the trajectory of the government, and this is what we're trying to do: is get underneath the skin of it and unpick it, what's really going on with it, and also try to predict the future as well as best we can. So, a couple of questions that have been thrown up. Thanks, Tim, for asking. First of all, Tim says, Greg, will the affordable housing be built by the public or private sector?
By the private sector, paid for by the public sector.
It's fairly straightforward. And another supplementary question that Tim, which also I guess relates back to it too, is it was also what's going on with levelling up. I know that there was a lot of supplementary papers. Whenever they do a budget, there's a lot of supplementary papers that come out, which you then got to go into the website to find, and that has all the detail, the small print really. Levelling up was included in some of that. Levelling up projects are going to go ahead, some that aren't going to go ahead. But where are we with levelling up right now?
I mean, I think that it's one of those terms that has been sort of quietly dropped by the government because of its association with the sort of preceding Tory administrations. But even kind of putting aside the kind of political spin, the political presentation, I'd come back to what I was saying earlier on about how the best way to understand this administration is to see it as one that operates predominantly in the interest of the civil service and the public sector. So it's not motivated most strongly by trying to take deprived areas and help them catch up to wealthier parts of the country. It's more interested in meeting the sort of needs and demands of the public sector and the sort of civil service who work within it.
Just going back to net zero, another question which has come from Jack. Why does cancelling net zero reduce energy costs in the long term?
Well, I suppose it depends on what you see as happening after the move away from net zero. This is going to make me sound extraordinarily cynical and kind of hard-nosed. A lot of Western Europe's net zero achievements have been made by effectively exporting the production of carbon emissions to low-income markets. So effectively, you stop producing steel, sort of exploring for oil or gas in the UK, and instead you have electric vehicles made in China using electricity from the new coal mine that they're opening, or new coal-fired power plant that they're opening every week. And so it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, really, is the nub of it as far as the UK goes. I don't think that model is sustainable, and I don't think it's sustainable on its own merits, but I certainly think it's going to come in for a bit of a clobbering over the next few years, because we see there being a much stronger geopolitical divide between basically a bloc led by the US and a bloc led by China. And so it'd be very much harder to export those carbon emissions to sort of emerging markets like China, because the trade between those two parts of the world won't be quite smooth.
Oh, we'll come on to that a bit later on, and what that means for us as this country, the geopolitical side of things, and what the US election might mean too. So we'll come on to that. I mean, these questions are coming thick and fast, so thanks. This was a good question that Jem has just asked, and there's one I was going to come on to actually, talking about PFI, new ways of funding projects, basically. We also talked about the fiscal rewriting of rules and how that's going to free up additional borrowing. So what else will the government be doing to encourage more funding for projects that don't sit on its balance sheet?
Yeah. But first of all, I'd say, Andy, it's great having loads and loads of questions. I mean, sort of politics and religion gets people going. So I'm very happy that people are chipping in. On the PFI question, I'd actually highlight something that's connected to that, but it's a little bit different. So we think that this administration, and to be fair, the last Tory government were looking at this as well, but this administration, I think, are inclined towards trying to find ways of mandating private investment into particular projects. So that's going to be felt first by institutional investors, so pension funds, for example. We would expect them, especially pension funds that are looking after public sector pensions, we would expect them to be mandated to put money into projects that the government has picked. So, for example, if you're going to operate in the UK, you have to put 5% of your investment into these particular projects. We think that kind of instruction is coming down the track. Now, PFI obviously had its problems, and it certainly is detractors in terms of the sort of political community and the wider public. And so I think they'll try to avoid using the term again. But some of the problems that PFI had are probably going to resurface with mandated investments. So, for example, at the moment, there are quite a few institutional investors who are relatively positive, if not sanguine, about the idea of mandated investments. And that's because if the government tells them they have to put money into a project, the corollary of that is that the government will also guarantee a certain level of return. So if it says you have to put money into it, it will guarantee that the fund gets a certain amount of money back. And so it's a pretty safe investment as far as they go. The downside is that guaranteed return, if the project doesn't work out to be financially viable, that guaranteed return has to be paid for by the taxpayer. So the taxpayer will probably get a bit of a rum deal out of mandated investments, basically. You know, if you have you have projects that the market decided weren't worth putting money into, there's a reason for that. If the government then turns around and tells them they have to and then pays them reasonably well for it, someone has to pick up the tab.
And just looking at a couple of other comments, obviously social housing keeps re-emerging, and the government's made a big deal around its 1.5 million homes to be built.
Yeah.
We've obviously talked a bit before about whether or not that's possible, and clearly that's going to be a tough stretch to achieve. But it's clear that social housing is going to be where the action is, as opposed to relying on the private sector to deliver on that target. And I guess from our perspective, the built environments, we work with housing associations, we work with local authorities. How does the government make it easier for them to build more social housing? Currently, a lot of money that was earmarked for social housing has been redirected towards recladding. So updating and refurbishing and modernising existing assets rather than building new assets. So I guess the trick now is to try and recalibrate using the new money or the extra money to get people building again, right? That's
right. And I think basically it comes down to sort of throwing money at the problem. That's going to be the government's solution. There are two stages to that, if you like. The first is that we see the government giving local authorities considerably more funding, and some of that will come with strings. So, for example, the government's trying to encourage various levels of local government to amalgamate into one sort of overarching body that basically the government can have a bit more influence over. So they'll give them more money up front to help pay for the construction, but they'll also give them financial incentives for when the project's completed. So, for example, increasing social rents. is a really good example. It's promising a long-term revenue stream to local authorities that are always looking for more funds. I think it's an interesting model, and it won't really be until, so it'll go public in probably March, some of the finer details. So I think we'd be confident on setting out what they will be by about January, a couple of months before it's in the papers. But I think if I was working for a local authority or a regional mayor, I would just encourage them to, just sort of trying to think of the right analogy, sort of Greeks bearing gifts, that kind of thing, because I think some of the funding and the responsibilities that will be awarded to regional or local government will actually be quite burdensome. So for example, we would expect local authorities to be given much more responsibility in terms of managing the welfare system. And part of the government's incentives there is to try to get some welfare spending off central government books. Again, to try to be able to come up with a more appealing pitch to the markets when they want to sell government debt. I think most local authorities would relish the responsibility of managing welfare spending, and they'd certainly be happy to have the funds to pay for it. But once you've got that responsibility, you've then got to make sure that the funds are available in perpetuity. And so that first slug of money is not the same as a promise that there will always be slugs of money coming from the government. That could end up with more than they wish for.
Yeah, just to pick up some more questions, and again, one that Georgina's asked, which is relevant for development, but also it could be the law of unintended consequences. Obviously, you've had the change in agricultural relief. Do you think that's going to see as more land is sold because inheritance tax can't be paid, it might free up more opportunities for investment and more land for development going forward?
Yes, I suppose. Yes, it could. Yes, I mean, if it's successfully applied, then yeah, it could see a lot of land disposals. My sort of slight caveat there is looking through all the measures in the budget documents. That was one that it just made me think, if there was a potential kind of black swan in this budget, then that's probably it, because the headline gamble, which we've already talked about, I think is pretty easy to identify, and even the media and public commentators are starting to catch up now.
Yeah, the fiscal rewriting all the rules. That's
That's right. With the agricultural land disposals and changes to inheritance tax and so on. If the UK was France, that would be the government's most perilous measure, because you guarantee you'd have tractors blocking out every road in every major city until it was revoked. That's less of a given in the UK. But if you think back to the sort of Tony Blair administrations, New Labour, one of the things that they hadn't seen coming, which just made them turn their policy agenda on a sixpence rather, was the fuel protests. And you had oil distribution or petrol distribution depots being blockaded by truck drivers, and there was a serious risk of the economy being brought to a halt within days. And I think if you have the UK agricultural sector, I think tends to take quite a lot on the chin. I could just see if there was there could be a tipping point where you had landowners thinking, right, well, the farm's been in the family for 5 generations. It looks like I won't be able to hand it on to my children. What have I got to lose? I might as well go and park the tractor on Whitehall. And I just think that there's a risk there for. I think it's low probability but high risk.
Yeah, interesting. We talk obviously about big fiscal events, and I suppose the next one will be in the spring. There'll be a spending review. There'll be clearer detail around capital expenditure. We'll understand more where the government's focus and priorities lie, and also where the money is coming from, how it's going to get spent. But interesting enough, and I read about it this morning, there's a hint, but you also mentioned it previously anyway, there was a hint that there's more to come in terms of tax rises. So it might be that at March, April next year, we have another round of another big fiscal event, basically.
I think so. I mean, so there are two separate things. There's the spending review, which will definitely happen, and that. Apologies for sort of stating something that's obvious, but the spending review sets out the kind of the large spending envelopes for each department over a long period of time. So it's basically saying, this is what your mortgage is going to cost for the next 3 years would be the analogy. Budgets are more tactical and say, well, this is what you can spend on your credit card for the next couple of months. Reeves has consistently said that she wants to pare back the number of fiscal statements that she makes each year. So you have one annual statement, one big budget. I just don't think she's going to be able to keep to that. Excuse me, for two reasons. One, I think she's going to need the opportunity to raise money more frequently than she thinks. So I think it'll come around to the spring, and they'll look to introduce more taxes regardless of whatever she says this morning about the kind of hard graft being done. And the other is that chancellors ultimately really love the opportunity of scoring political points and having the platform of a big fiscal statement. I think probably 4 out of the past 6 chancellors have said they want to go back to doing annual statements and stop doing 2 a year, and they all did 2 a year because having 2 bites of the cherry is better politically than 1.
Yeah, and do you think economically wise they might find there's no room? They have to go back and keep coming back and saying, right, here's another update. We need to do this. We need to do that. We need to raise this. We need to raise that. There needs to be a constant slew of tax increases. Basically, we haven't seen the end of this, have we?
Well, I mean, Andrew, the answer to that depends on your view of 2 things. One is whether you think the public sector is astute in its ability to invest in projects that create a return. If Rachel Reeves' investments start, sort of turning a profit, then she won't need to raise taxes. If they don't start to turn a profit, and she sort of accidentally picks a few white elephants or puts money into inefficient programs, then yes, she'd need to raise money. The second thing that you'll need to take a view on is whether or not you think that the international gilt markets are willing to lend the government more money without increasing the cost of that debt. As I said earlier, I think part of that does depend on, it's a bit like an ugly baby contest that you don't want the UK to win. It's markets, we're looking at every other country and trying to decide whether they're a better or worse investment than the UK. If interest rates on UK debt, if debt servicing costs go up as the government simultaneously borrows more and more and more, then obviously the cost of servicing that debt will become larger and larger. And the debt servicing cost is already if it was a government department, it would be the second largest department in the government. If that cost continues to go up, then they're going to need to raise taxes to meet the expense.
So I guess watch this space, right?
That's right. Or sign up to our reports, and you'll be 6 months ahead of everyone else. That's
it. Well, and by all means, link into Greig on LinkedIn as well. But just a question that Danny's asked, which I thought was quite interesting. I was going to come to this anyway, actually. But what are the geopolitical and geoeconomic headwinds that you're worried about right
now? Obviously, there are lots of eyes on the US for next week. And I think that from a kind of political boffin perspective, it's an extraordinary thing that such a a presidential election with potentially huge ramifications is likely to boil down to the whim of about 100,000 US voters in an electorate of 200, 300 million people. So obviously eyes are there, but I think that some of the geopolitical trends that will most affect us in the UK are going to continue regardless of who wins in the States. I mentioned before about the sort of increasing split between a sort of bloc led by the US and a bloc led by China. You know, if China establishes a blockade around Taiwan within the next year or so, which we think there's a pretty decent chance they will, then that would have really massive effects on global trade.
Yeah,
but even without those kind of dramatic one-off events, there's going to be a sort of move away from.
I was going to say, Greg. I mean, I know you mentioned something like that could happen. I think you mentioned it last year, and that's actually now being spoken about for the first time as a potential headwind, anyway, as a potential threat over there. So that's interesting whether that comes to pass or not. But that's clearly something we need to factor in, isn't it?
Definitely. I think there are. I'm sure I used this analogy last time about the kind of taking small children and bowling, but if you can work out what the structural restraints are on politics, and you can work out roughly where things are going to end up, it's like having the buffers up on the bowling alley. Ball ricochets everywhere, but you can work out roughly where it's going to end up. And I think that there are some factors that will be consistent, regardless of what happens in terms of elected politics. Whether that's in the UK or further afield, and they're well worth trying to kind of have in mind when you're working out your strategy for the next year ahead.
And just one last question about geopolitics before I come on to some other questions that have been asked. There's obviously a lot of controversy, if that's the right word, with regards to the Labour Party being seen to, even as volunteers, support Kamala Harris. I mean, obviously, it's on a knife edge, the US election. But if Trump does win, will that controversy have any long-term implications for the way that a Trump administration deals with the current administration, or will Trump just brush that under the carpet and is like, in a pragmatic way, just say, well, that was that, but now I've got to be the statesman?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that spring to mind about that, Andy. One is it's slightly frustrating to see a UK administration be quite so naive. I mean, objectively, sending 100 volunteers over to the States for a nationwide presidential election, it is not going to change the price of fish. It's not going to affect the result. But what it does do is potentially affect the relationship between a Trump administration, if one came in, and the UK government here. There's just no need for it. The return on that investment is not high enough to justify the risk. So it's slightly frustrating seeing the naivety of that. In terms of the actual effect on the relationship, on the one hand, I think a Trump administration would be predominantly transaction-based, transaction-focused. So if there's, for example, a good free trade agreement to strike with the UK, it's not going to undermine that or stop it. But at the same time, if you look at the UK government's engagement with the US over its first 3 or 4 months in power, it's had to spend a lot of time making up ground. The foreign secretary has had to go out of his way every time he goes over to the States to see a long list of Republican grandees to try to counter the social media comments he's made over the past couple of years about neo-Nazi sympathizing socialists and so on. They're having to undo unnecessary errors, and for an administration that could have had a very high degree of confidence of coming into office in July, it's a bit frustrating that they're having to spend their first few months undoing unnecessary mistakes rather than applying a plan that had been well thought through and sort of carefully prepared.
Yeah.
I always sort of draw an analogy with Gordon Brown. I think in terms of his individual suitability to the role of prime minister. I think he was almost singularly ill-suited to being prime minister. He was up there with Theresa May, but he'd obviously coveted the office for a long time, and he'd spent a lot of time preparing his first few months. And so you might not remember, but his honeymoon in office was actually pretty well marked. He was very popular. He got some stuff done. He was seen as this kind of national security hawk who successfully addressed terrorism concerns and so on. He basically hit the ground running and had a good first few months. After that, events take over, and any government is buffeted by events and basically has to try to sort of react to them. This administration has come in after a good few years of when it should have been confident of winning the election, and the first few months have just been a mess. Just politically on sort of low-level tactical stuff, and they spent time on things they really shouldn't have had to spend time with. They should have had, I think, 3 or 4 months where they applied a plan that had been really carefully thought through. They enjoyed the honeymoon, and then you get down to the kind of gritty side of governing, and they just missed that opportunity.
Interesting. Just a couple more questions while we still got you. Georgina talks about, what do you think this budget will do for interest rates?
I think it'll push them up.
Okay, that's a good bold prediction. Because at the moment, it seems the trajectory is going down, isn't it? Or has been.
Yeah, although the UK is sort of cutting them at a slightly slower rate, and I suppose it's my answer was slightly glib. We as a professional service, we don't predict interest rates. Partly because it ultimately comes down to a very small group of people who could they wake up and have the wrong sort of cereal for breakfast that morning and it changes their mind. They're not sort of within any kind of structural restraints. But sort of objectively, I think that the government's increased appetite for borrowing will persuade the markets to put debt servicing costs up, and ultimately that gets passed on to consumers. So that's why I think they will probably go up, or at least they won't go down at the same rate as in other markets.
Okay. A couple of other bits. Kishan asked, how do you think national insurance hikes and increase in national minimum wage will affect SME construction firms? So that's, I guess, we've got people listening who work for an SME company, and it's like, well, how do they survey their future now?
I think that it's going to be those sort of smaller firms, regardless of whether it's construction sector or anywhere else, that really kind of bear the brunt of that NIC change. And sorry, we're ringing somewhere.
Sorry, that shows it's live, right? Because
yes, exactly.
Shows. I can't edit
There's
it
a
out.
very good chance of one of my children running behind me in a minute.
I can't edit it out. So.
I think that's going. I think the NIC changes are going to be a bit of a kick in the shins for SME construction firms. In a lot of other sectors, there will be an automatic recourse to using more freelancers and contractors. But obviously, in the construction sector, that has sort of additional regulatory issues as well. I think it's basically going to be a bit tricky.
So as we sort of look forward now, between now and next spring, the next big government announcement, how do you think the next 6 months are going to pan out?
I think that the budget won't have done anything to arrest the UK government's decline in the public opinion polls. I think that the international debt markets will slowly but steadily express more skepticism about the government's ability to service its debt. So it's not going to be a kind of Liz Truss moment where it all happens in 24 hours, but it'll basically be a similar effect stretched over 6-12 months. And I think that Labour backbenchers will become increasingly unruly. I think that there are some some politically tricky moments coming up that are quite you can anticipate with a high degree of confidence. So, for example, we would expect there to be considerable, large-scale, widespread industrial action, especially in the public sector over the next 3 to 6 months. We expect the NHS to be perceived by the public as performing very, very poorly indeed. And all of these things kind of add up to more political pressure on the government. Now, because of the size of the government's majority, that political pressure won't automatically lead to them being forced out of office. But what it does do, it's a bit like with the budget yesterday. Actually, I would argue that the changes introduced there were brave in the sense that the government didn't have an explicit mandate for them. They kind of ran counter to the Labour Party's manifesto and to their general election campaign. I think if you have a series of political pressures weighing on the administration, and the public begins to think, well, we didn't actually give you permission to apply the solutions you're trying to apply, and backbenchers steadily become less inclined to vote for those solutions, that's when you start building up towards getting closer and closer to governments losing confidence votes and so on. As I say, I don't think we're there yet, but I think, as I know I've said to you, Andy, before, I don't see this administration lasting a full 5-year term. I don't think they'd necessarily be replaced by an alternative flavour of government, but I think that they will have to seek a more explicit mandate from the public to do some of the things they're going to have to do.
Yeah, I mean, on that subject, obviously the Conservatives have a leadership contest that's nearing the end. It could be generic, it could be Badenoch. If you were Labour, does it matter who's the next leader of the Conservatives? I mean, are they so far back at the moment, or how's it going?
No, I think it does matter. The Tories, this is very much a personal view, but I think the Tories face a choice of a low risk, low reward candidate and a high risk, high reward candidate. I think, given the state that they're in at the moment, if I was choosing on their behalf, I'd probably be more inclined to go for the high risk, high reward candidate. But I mean, that's part of my kind of, any kind of business owner tends to be more willing to take risks, I think. So that's my sort of personal bias. It will make a difference, because if the Conservative opposition can start to get political traction and make a decent fist of opposing the government, then there's no reason why the political polls, public opinion polls, couldn't change very dramatically, very quickly. That's one of the things that Brexit did. It made the voting electorate much more fluid. People are willing to change their views, flip from one party to another much more quickly than they have in the past. If the Conservatives don't get their act together, then I think you'll see more money, more sort of administrative resource, and more people looking for other parties to join. So, reform would benefit as an obvious. And then you really need to sort of see where we are in 6 months' time as to how that's likely to pan out in the next general election.
And obviously, it's been talked about previously about the Conservatives and Reform doing some sort of, deal. I mean, can you see that happening?
I could see it happening, but I think there's a decent chance of them merging in one way or another, either amicably or one taking over the other. And this isn't something that it's not something I put money on, but it's something that I think is worth keeping an eye on. Over the past 40 years, the Conservatives have benefited electorally by centre-left and hard-left votes being split. So essentially the Liberal Democrats, or the SDP as it was before, and Labour kind of had to share out those votes, which made it harder for Labour to win office. Excuse me. I don't think it's beyond imagination that over the next 20 to 40 years, the UK electorate could have a range of viable or a range of options to vote for on the right. So you could have the Tories and Reform competing in roughly the same pool. And if that happens, it could go one way or the other. You could have a sort of long run of electoral successes for Labour because they don't actually have to win as many seats to get into government, or you could end up going even further and have, for example, a Conservative government and Reform being the major opposition. So things will be in flux over the next sort of 10 years or so electorally.
Interesting, and I suppose that's it. Give that insight, that thinking, which perhaps almost the unthinkable. Can you imagine that one new party replacing other parties being potential opposition? But anyway, I thought as we're approaching the end, are there any takeaways that you can give our audience today from yesterday?
I think the biggest things to bear in mind, the biggest things that I'd encourage people to try to think about and keep an eye on. One is that the government's macroeconomic strategy is heavily predicated on this big gamble that they can borrow more and more and that markets won't punish them for it. If that gamble comes off, then Labour could in a way be sitting pretty. If it doesn't, then I think they're in a real pickle. I think regardless of how that pans out, there are some consistent threats and opportunities for the sector. We talked a little bit about the sort of increased difficulty of employing people on the downside. On the upside, I think there's going to be a lot of money spent on social housing and on land disposals. And then, sort of more widely, just from a kind of political anorak's point of view, I think the political environment will be set by which of the parties starts to be more politically astute more quickly. So if Labour can stop having to make up ground for silly mistakes, or if the Tories can come in with a new leader who can really kind of grab the media narrative and people's imagination, then I think things could that will have a really big impact on what next year looks like.
Well, look, thanks, Greg, and that's been really interesting. And I would thank everyone else also for tuning in and providing some great questions too. And it's been a really interactive session. So our hour's practically up, and I want to say thank you again to everyone. And we'll do this again at the spending review in March. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.